if I remember, projects I ran, for example, over at BT with so many people, very, very complex. It's interesting when you try to apply all that theory, and there's so much out there, but there's a lot of been written, as you said, some of those ideas are back from the 60s, 70s. They've been around for half a century,
Yeah.
still haven't not been quite picked up as much as they should have been. But there's also the difference between the theory and the reality, right? So you take a model, you take a methodology, and then you apply it to reality. And I've never been in a single project where I would 100% apply or be able to apply what's in the book, because that's not how people work. But often organizations seem to think about that's how it can work. And you talk about something called clumsy problems, I think. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, so the clumsy term, it comes originally from work by Mary Douglas, who talked about cultural theory. Her argument is that by and large, again, this is a heuristic sense-making activity, by and large, you can divide cultures up in terms of people's response to rules and people's response to roles. So you can have organizations that are very rule-bound, or you can have organizations that are very bound into the group. When you divide those, the rule-bound and the group-bound approaches, you get what has been called elegant cultural theory. So you get hierarchists, you get egalitarians, you get individualists, and you get fatalists. And her argument is that by and large, most organizations fit roughly into something like this box. Although, again, the closer you look, the more granular the approach, the more you realize that actually organizations fit across a lot of these boundaries. But anyway, so the point is that when you're facing a tame problem, that your organizational culture was probably constructed to resolve the tame problem, so that you develop standard procedures for fixing 75% of the stuff that comes across your desk every morning. That the culture that you've developed across time is perfectly efficacious for those kinds of problems. But the difficulty is that those same elegant cultures tend to be disproportionately antagonistic to when you're facing a wicked problem. Let me give you an example of how this works. So a few years ago, I was doing some work with some social workers, children's social workers, and they had developed an elegant culture which is primarily egalitarian. So whenever they were having a meeting about the safety of a child, they developed a culture where everybody could chip into the conversation, that there wasn't a hierarchy involved in this. If you've got something to say about this child, then it was your duty to say it. And the culture was very supportive of everybody lending a hand and coming to some kind of group decision. Because if you kept information back, if you were frightened of what the boss might think and you didn't say something about the child might die. Now, what that elegant and egalitarian culture also did is make it really difficult for the same group to make individual decisions about children. So even though we could collect lots of information about a child, if it then became my responsibility as an individual to make a decision about the child, it was very difficult to do in a group, because the group was always distracted and would dispute what should be done about this. So what's happening here is the elegant culture is great for getting information out. We're all a team here, we're all a group, let's just talk about this child. But in terms of making the decision, what the group predominance did is make it difficult for individuals to make decisions. And that was actually quite useful, because it protected individuals from being held responsible if something terrible happened to that child. So the elegant culture that they had developed was really good for information gathering, but really bad for decision making, because it also protected people from responsibility. And organizations tend to do that. They develop cultures which are good for some things and bad for other things. And the clumsy argument is, when you're trying to address a wicked problem, you have to get beyond the norm, your normal elegant cultural approach, whatever it happens to be. You have to get beyond that and start thinking about how you can approach it with different kind of cultural forms. So let me give another example. I had a PhD student at one point who was looking at a military unit, and the officer in charge of the military unit wanted to develop an egalitarian group to discuss the future of this particular military group. The problem is, of course, with a military, it's very, very hierarchical and very formal. So they were very resistant to any kind of egalitarian groupthink, because what they wanted to do is stick to their ranks or stick to their stovepipes, their skill stovepipes. So the boss of this particular group said, well, this is inhibiting us from thinking about what the future will look like in 20 years. So we're going to have an egalitarian approach to this. And every month we will have a dinner. There'll be no uniforms, so you won't know what rank people are. And we will use first name terms. And we will have a broad discussion about what the future is of this particular group. And my PhD student's task was to facilitate these dinners and discussions over 18 months. And he said the really strange thing about this was this particular group did operate as an egalitarian group, despite the hierarchy, despite the stovepiping, for the first time ever. But it only ever worked as long as the boss, the overriding commanding officer, was still in the room. Now, if you were trying to design something using the elegant cultural mode and you wanted an egalitarian group, you would have all kinds of rules and procedures for making sure that nobody was in charge and it was an egalitarian proceeding. But that didn't work. And the clumsy bit was the only way you could make the egalitarian group work was if you had the hierarchy sitting around the egalitarian group, i.e., if the boss was in the room. As soon as the boss left the room, the egalitarian group broke back down into its hierarchy of rank and its stovepipes of skills. So this is what we would call a clumsy approach. You wouldn't design it like this. You would never design an egalitarian group to fit within a hierarchy because they seem to be counterproductive. But it actually worked. And that's the point with the clumsy bit. Sometimes these things just evolve by practice. I mean, they have to work in practice. But if you were to look theoretically and say, would this work? The answer would be no, because it's contradictory. And that's the point. Quite a lot of the so-called clumsy approach is to say, well, not can we design something which looks nice on paper, but what is actually working, whether it's hypothetically accurate or theoretically sophisticated, does it actually work or not? And that's the clumsy bit. Does it work?